realities of racism. And tonight we're focusing on the challenges members of Indigenous communities are experiencing in the tech sector. A recent survey conducted by calmit.org found that over half of Indigenous Canadians experience discrimination in the workplace, over half choosing to play down their Indigenous background to, quote, better fit in. Pablo Liskengart is the executive director of calmit.org, and Pablo joins me now. Pablo, appreciate you giving me your time today.
Thank you for mine. Thank you so much, Angie, for having me.
Absolutely. It's such an important topic here. If we could delve into the numbers first, talk to us a bit more about what the survey you did found about workplace environment for Indigenous people.
Well, the survey is pretty clear in showing us that we still have a long way to go as a society, right? Mm-hmm. When 62% of Indigenous Canadians surveyed say that they have experienced bias when applying for a job, 59% say that they have experienced discrimination in their current workplaces, and 56% of them play down their Indigenous backgrounds to fit in better at the workplace. Then that shows us that we are not doing that well as a society as we think we are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, absolutely. We're just showing our viewers some of these numbers here coming from that survey, as you mentioned there. 62%, we know, close to 59% experiencing discrimination in the current workplace. 56.2% downplaying their Indigenous background to, quote, fit in better in the workplace. And almost 34% are choosing not to list Indigenous on social media profiles. Are the numbers shocking, or are they expected? And if so, why is that, Pablo?
Well, these numbers should be shocking to Canadians and to Canadian employers. We simply need to do better. I hope this shocks some C-suite executives to take a hard look at what's really happening in their workplaces. For years, we've been hearing about cultural awareness training at companies, and we've been partnering with Google for several years, working with communities. And so some numbers are not that shocking to us, but we need to formalize that information for sure.
Indeed. And talk to me a little bit more about focusing on the IT sector and why that was so critical here.
Well, the first thing that I want to say is that we are not in such a bad position as we could be, right? I know that several companies have been working on cultural awareness, but we still have a long way to go. By no means we should think that because we run internal trainings that things are done. We need to constantly measure and ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. And we still have to do a lot more if we truly want to move the dial towards equality and inclusion.
Yeah.
The numbers don't lie.
Yeah, exactly. And I can only imagine, I mean, just as you're gathering all of this information, how those that are taking the survey are feeling about all of this as we talk about truth and reconciliation. We talk about, as you say, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So from your perspective in gathering these numbers, what can we do with this information?
Well, what can we do? It's tough to say, right? Like, the idea is that we are running this survey to make the issue visible. So now it's time for every employer to ask themselves, and who is serious about diversity, to ask themselves if they are truly working on inclusion or just moving people around, right? Like, they have to ask how inclusive their hiring practices are and their internal processes are, right? Like, we always have to remember that diversity comes from inclusion.
Right. There's also the number of microaggressions, the stereotypes that exist, and the survey did find those numbers as well. About 75% found that the stereotypes impact perceptions of their capability in the IT sector. Talk to me about that, because it comes back down to making that first impression without giving the individual an opportunity to give them a first impression.
Well, one of the things is that one of the questions, or several of the questions that we asked in the survey, was what kind of professions their family would be more proud of if they follow it, or what kind of professions they think that they will help provide for their families. And unfortunately, IT wasn't among the first answers. When you experience bias and prejudice along the way, that discourages people to join a certain industry. And well, we all know that Canada has a lack of tech talent, and we could have tens of thousands of talented people more in the industry if many of these prejudices are properly tackled.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about, sort of, as you said earlier, trying to move that dial, having someone in a leadership position is critical in all of this. But again, when we look at the survey and you look at the numbers, the lack of Indigenous representation in C-suite positions in the tech sector, again, those numbers are still relatively high, with almost 37% or over 37% feeling that they feel that at a large extent. 36, almost 37% feel moderate about this. And then the numbers go 16.2 for, to a small extent, to 7% saying this is a serious problem. It is a serious problem, though, Pablo, regardless of the numbers. Yes,
100%. Last year, I started doing a research on this topic, and then I found out that representation of Indigenous peoples in IT was only 1.2%, whereas the non-Indigenous people in tech were around 5%, right? So you can see the difference, and you can start to transfer that into numbers, and then you will realize that we are missing out on 30,000, 40,000 people working in the tech sector.
Where do we need to go from here? Where, how, and again, using this information because it's critical, you point out moving the dial here, but where do you want to see things going from here? You're a company that works to try and improve and engage inequality in the workplace.
Yes, we need to be flexible. I think that flexibility is key to understand other people. Listening to others is key, right? And trying to understand these numbers and trying to see and to ask ourselves those uncomfortable questions, and then changing our own procedures, our own processes to make it more welcoming for people who can be working in this industry and any other industry, right? Again, as I mentioned, diversity comes from inclusion. So it's not only about diversity hires and moving people around. It's actually including new people in the industry to make them, ready to provide and to contribute to the Canadian economy. Indeed.
We appreciate you giving us your time today. Such an important survey that you've conducted. A lot of information there. Pablo Lisnard is the Executive Director of ComIT.org. Pablo, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Angie.
You're very welcome.